Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Use the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. I'm in Seattle. Anna's out on the Washington coast. Rachel is in Australia. And where are you? We'll get started pretty soon. More Seattle. McCall, Idaho. Hello. All right, we'll let a couple more people get logged in here and we'll get started. Oh, Vancouver Island. Oh, beautiful. You live in Squamish. Oh, hello, Mexico. Oh my gosh, we're all over North America tonight. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop here in Seattle called Book Larder. And we have just started to do some in-person cooking classes and just a few in-person author talks as we sort of gradually put ourselves back out in the world again. But for the time being, we are also doing most of our author talks here on Zoom. And that gives us the opportunity to do a talk like the one tonight, where, as I mentioned at the beginning, the interviewer and the author are in completely different parts of the world. And you're joining us from all over the place. And it's a really lovely thing. And I think one of the nice things that's come out of all we've been through in the past couple of years. So thank you for joining us. I am delighted to welcome Rachel Signer tonight. She is the author of the brand new book, You Had Me at Pet-NAT. She is the creator of Pipette Magazine, which we have so proudly carried at Book Larder for however many years now. And she is going to be actually in conversation with Anna Brones, but also giving us a tour in a little bit of her vineyard. And so you're going to get a book talk and a sort of very sunny look at South Australia in just a few minutes. But as I mentioned, she's going to be in conversation with Anna Brones, who is a Washington State-based author and cooking instructor. They're going to talk about the book. I will drop a little link in the chat so that you can purchase it from us and support the talk if you are so inclined. Thank you to everyone that's done that so far. And if you have questions, if you could please just use that little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for those questions. We will leave time for those as well. All right, so I am going to turn things over to Rachel Signer and Anna Brones.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, Rachel.
Hey, Anna. Good to see you.
It's nice to see you. I didn't used to be a fan of Zoom stuff right at the beginning of pandemic, but then I feel like it's the one thing that I really appreciate that we like carry with us as we get to do stuff like this. Just think it's like really cool to get to connect with people like all over the place.
Yeah, I do wish I was visiting Seattle in person, to be completely honest, but this is a good start for now.
Yeah. Absolutely. Cool. Well, can you just share with us exactly where you are in Australia? Like, what are we? You're in your house. Just like describe for us where you are.
We are in the Adelaide Hills, just outside Adelaide. So Adelaide's a pretty small city, and then you take this one road up, and high up above the city are the hills, which is an agricultural and viticultural region, a little bit of logging as well. And we are at the end of this long road. So we're in this kind of valley, and we have a veggie patch, which supplies my husband's restaurant. We have two wineries, one for my husband and one for me. And then lots of baby vines that we planted over the past 2 years.
That's awesome. So I actually just finished, I actually listened to your book instead of reading on the page, but I just finished it this morning, and I was kind of thinking like, it was such like a winding journey, and that's how I'm envisioning this interview going, because I just have so many questions I want to ask you, and we'll probably like hop all over the place. And I would say that to anybody who's listening, you might also feel like you have questions that pop up. So just feel free to put them in the Q&A thing. And I'll be moderating those kind of towards the end. So we're going to just sort of like, Rachel and I are going to chat. I'm going to ask questions. We're going to do a little vineyard tour, and then there'll be some time at the end for everybody to ask questions. So as they come up, feel free to drop them in there, and then we can get to them. But I just want to start, you have a copy of the book there, right? Can you hold it up so everybody knows what it looks like?
There it is.
Yay, a natural wine soaked memoir. I want to just talk a little bit about your background and your journey first, just so people kind of get a better idea of who you are if they're kind of new to the world of Rachel. Can you talk about like how you got into wine, writing, just sort of what sort of got you into that to begin with?
Well, I spent the first half of my 20s believing I was on the path to becoming an academic, and I wanted to be a cultural anthropology professor. And I originally was very engaged in Latin American studies, and then I switched to Sub-Saharan Africa, specifically West Africa, and then I just got out entirely. I was a bit burnt out. I did my master's degree in New York City, which was very expensive and intense. And I'm very grateful for that experience. But following that, I basically went back to New York. I'd been in Senegal for 3 months. I went back to New York. You know, I had, again, no possessions because I just was a grad student, found an apartment, and I just started freelance writing. And I had this idea that I was going to figure out how to be a journalist. My parents were both newspaper reporters at one point in the Washington, D.C. area where I grew up. So I had a concept that you could be a writer, and I worked for a couple different publications and basically learned on the job, or sat in on classes here and there. Never went to journalism school, also never studied winemaking, never studied wine formally at all. So I'm not a sommelier. I don't have any winemaking background. But then I actually got really interested in writing fiction. And when I started writing fiction, I kind of stopped doing journalism. I don't know how you do illustration and writing. My brain can only do like one thing. It's really bizarre. So I'm either doing journalism or I'm doing creative writing. And so I was suddenly like having no income. I'd been kind of living off journalism for a couple of years, and then I was writing a novel and I had no income. So I walked into a restaurant and asked for a job. And it was a big deal for me because I was like 28 and I had worked in restaurants from ages 15 to 23. And I never found it particularly like desirable. I don't know. I think after a certain point, I swore it off and I said, I'm done. I'm going to grad school. I'm done with restaurants. Yeah. So there I was going back, crawling on my hands and knees to a restaurant job. But it was actually really amazing. So I do describe it in the book in the first couple of chapters. It was one of Andrew Tarlow's restaurants. So for West Coast people that may not have heard of him, Andrew Tarlow opened a place called Diner in Brooklyn 15 years ago. And it was kind of the first farm to table restaurant in the city. And since then, he's kind of built up an empire. Marlowe and Sons is pretty well known. So that was a pretty amazing place to work. The way people were treated was better than any restaurant in New York or any place I'd experienced. It was a bit of a family culture, and there was a lot of staff education. And as I describe in the book, basically, there was this one pet-nat that was my gateway into this world of natural wine. And I don't know whether you want me to continue on that.
Yeah. Well, one thing I was thinking about, because I was thinking because you're such like a pet-nat lover, but I was actually wondering from the writing perspective, if the memory of that wine was kind of like good for the setup of the book and the journey. And if that actually was like the entry point wine, or if you'd had like a natural wine drinking experience like before.
Yeah, well, your memory sort of edits and condenses itself. And so I'm sure that I tasted something other than that wine. But what I remember when I think of that time is me looking at my clock and saying, okay, it's 11. I've been here since 7. In 1 hour, I get off my shift and I can have my 2 shift drinks. So at noon, my 2 shift drinks. It's like ridiculous, but it was the policy. And that's what I did. I would get off at noon, I'd sit at the bar and I'd drink this pet-nat.
Yeah.
And it was fizzy and pink and off dry. So like a tiny, tiny bit sweet. And it's pretty low in alcohol. And it just like woke me. I'd been awake since 5:30 and, you know, I'd ridden my bike to work, probably didn't have a shower that day. It just kind of awakened me and it made me ready to confront the rest of the day, which was actually going to my second job. And that was, so it really was, because I think I didn't realize that like wine could be energizing and uplifting until I had natural wine. And that's like what natural wine is for me.
And what had your what had your relationship to wine been before that?
Oh, boxes of it, or Trader Joe's Merlot. Yeah, I mean, I remember a grad school party where my boyfriend was trying to impress everyone. He spent $30 on a Sauvignon Blanc, and I was like kind of embarrassed because it was so expensive. Like that was the most expensive wine I'd ever had. So big change, yeah, from that.
Yeah. I was just thinking, we keep saying pet-nat, and then I realized we should probably define what that is for people. If people don't know what that is, can you just, what is pet-nat and like, what is natural wine, I guess, just for anybody who's new to that?
Yeah. So natural wine is made from organically farmed grapes or biodynamically farmed vineyards, and it's made without any additives. So conventional wine can use lots of additives like tartaric acid or mega purple or even powdered tannins. And all of those additives are used to change the flavor and to make the wine more standardized and more commercial. And then there's also a preservative called sulfur dioxide that's used almost universally in winemaking in very, very high amounts. So in natural wine, none of those additives are used except for sulfur dioxide in small amounts, like much, much, much smaller. And the point is to deliver like a very singular living product that is less commercial and more handmade, more representative of the family that grows the vineyard, more naked and raw and pure. Alive is a word people often use. There probably are some bacteria that stay alive through the bottling. So pet-nat is a style, and it is a natural wine style. And it helps to understand that the way most sparkling wine is made involves additives. So it involves certain additives for flavors, but also added yeast and added sugar. And pet-nat does not. So pet-nat is a sparkling wine made from just grapes. There's a whole chapter on it in the book. So I really did my best to kind of explain it in full because we make pet-nat also. So I talked about that. But the other cool thing about pet-nat is that it can be made literally anywhere in the world from any grapes. So you never know what's in it. You can have a pet-nat from California, a pet-nat from Vermont, a pet-nat from France, from Australia. And it just means pétillant naturel, which is French for sparkling naturally sparkling. And there's a whole movement behind it, which I also describe in the book, that does come from France. So that's the nutshell version. And I'm guessing people will have more questions specifically about those things.
Totally. It's a deep dive. I was also thinking, what did you say the name of that additive? What, magic purple?
Yeah, mega purple. It just makes that,
purple.
you know, that like nice dark purpley red color that you see on a lot of supermarket reds.
Yeah. I was just saying that'd be
grape
like
juice.
Yeah, that would be like a great title for a memoir too, you know, like
oh yeah,
mega purple, like deep dive
for my expose where I go pretend I do a Michael Moore and like get inside the conventional wine industry.
Exactly.
They would totally figure me out in like 5 minutes. It would not work.
Love that. So one thing that I was thinking about that sort of came to mind as I was reading the book. So just for people who haven't read it, I don't want to like spoiler alert the book, but it's basically about your journey from what seems like this very serendipitous, you getting this job at the restaurant. It sort of seems like then this sort of step into this world that kind of puts you on this path that was so unanticipated. But something that I was really thinking of in terms of wine was like, you end up on this path where you end up connecting with like a lot of producers. You end up going to a lot of vineyards, talking to winemakers, being like in the places where that wine is made and having this like close connection to that wine, not just sitting and drinking and tasting and, you know, like grading wine or whatever. And something that came to mind was I saw that film like several years ago called Somm, which is like about the dudes who are like training for the like the master sommelier certification. And I remember when I was watching that film, like it was really impressive, their just like ability to retain all kinds of knowledge about places in the world. And but I always remember watching that film like, man, they have all this knowledge and yet it seems this like disconnect from the reality of what it takes to make wine.
Mhm.
And I'm just interested, like I think that's something that's interesting in the natural wine world is it seems to be there's just like this closer connection to how the wine is produced and like what is required and the reality of that, and that it is an agricultural product. And I'm just wondering if you could like maybe speak to that a little bit about that sort of connection to that part of wine and that has
Mhm.
now brought you to being a winemaker yourself.
Yeah, I mean, meeting the producers in natural wine has been my deepest kind of obsession for years because the producers' stories are endlessly fascinating. And while there are some patterns, like in terms of returning to things that their parents did or their grandparents did, or making a whole break from conventional farming and converting their vineyards to biodynamics, those patterns exist. I mean, each story is so singular and so amazing. And it is really amazing what people do to make natural wine. And yeah, I am so far away from the approach in that movie Somm, and not least of all, because it's all, you know, dudes, but I'm not interested in certifications or proving anything with my knowledge. I've forgotten most of the appellations at this point. Most natural wine is made outside of the appellation system anyway. Appellations are just kind of official regions, and the name of it goes on the label if it's accepted. Anyway, natural wine, because it's made so radically, it's usually kicked out of the appellations anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think we often get this idea that a bottle of wine is like a static product, and that's the wine. But wine changes every year, and especially natural winemakers, you'll notice that you have a wine from them, and then the next year that wine's not there and it's a different wine. And that's because it's this creative process, and people are always trying to figure out, what is my vineyard saying to me right now? And how do I best interpret that so people enjoy wine? And it's not going to necessarily be the same every year. Like I think it drives people crazy that my husband makes 15 wines every year and they are basically always totally different. And at the same time, that's the only way he knows how to make wine, because the fruit is different every year, and he's tasting and blending and trying to, you know, like figuring out different ways to ferment also. And it's just not static. We're all constantly working to improve what we do, and improving, you know, if we have like land to farm, like trying to improve that, or trying to improve the vineyards that you work with. And so that aspect of connecting with the producers is the most amazing thing. And that's what I tried to kind of bring people to with the magazine Pipette. That was the original goal of the magazine. And then with the book as well. And, you know, I love helping people like do that and meet producers. Before the pandemic, I was starting a little company to lead tours of natural wineries. I don't know if I'll ever get back to that. It does sound nice.
I think all of us are doing things pre-pandemic that we may or may not get back to, but let's talk about the magazine for a little bit. Cause so you end up, you end up taking your writing skills and passion, and then yay, I have a copy. Do you want to talk about, so that you started another magazine before that, and can you talk about just sort of that process and how that came about and how that led into Pipette?
Two friends and I wanted to do a print magazine. We thought it would be fun and kind of whimsical. At the time, I had just done this big trip through the Loire Valley that was mind-blowing. And I was obsessed with some of the stories that I had kind of taken in. And I was like, I don't know how I'm going to get all these stories out, but I have to. And all of the mainstream publications were telling me no. And I was like, why are they not like, but it's because natural wine is considered very niche. And I thought maybe it's time for me to start something. And so the other two co-creators were sort of in the natural wine food scene in different ways. One was a photographer, one was a painter. And that worked pretty well. But then kind of as we were launching is when I moved to Paris and my life got a bit hectic. And then suddenly I was like moving to Australia. And I think that made it really hard to keep up because it was such a nice thing when we could actually see each other. And one of them had a baby as well. And at some point I decided, I think I better try this on my own. And I was definitely nervous about setting out on my own. I was like, I have no idea if people are going to actually support this thing, because the original magazine was about wine, but also food and coffee. We made it really broad, which is what most magazines are. And then with Pipette, I went fully into focusing on natural wine. And it was an exclusively natural wine focused magazine. At the time, I wasn't sure what that would result in, but it turns out that that's actually a really good approach for indie magazines. So the more niche, the better, apparently, is the way it works. So it was successful, and the first issue sold out within, I think, 6 months and kept going. And so we've done 10.
What year was that? What year was that, the first issue?
I'm checking the date on the magazine, 2018.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was, I mean, fairly recently, like it's not too long ago that you started that. But how do you think, even in that time, like, how do you think that the sort of natural wine world has changed, or like just the writing about natural wine? Because it seems to me, so I lived in Paris as well. And that was my entry point to natural wine. And when I moved back here in 2015, it was like, okay, good luck.
Yeah.
And even in this time, like it's just changed so much here even. And like, just what I read about it, you see natural wine pop up in like, I would say fairly more standard, regular, conventional people writing about wine. So like, how have you seen that kind of shift take place?
I think the movement has grown so much, and I've just been amazed by how many businesses are opening in the States and elsewhere. I know there was someone from Mexico on this video, and I've seen quite a few things open up there. Canada, oh my gosh, like just booming, and it's awesome. It's great. And they seem to be stocking all the like classics that I loved in New York. It's great. Like the market is totally growing, or the community, how I'd rather sort of talk about it. And these places seem wonderful, like really beautiful branding, like seems like they're really trying to have a personal approach to it. So I'm very optimistic about natural wine as a scene. I think there was a bit of a growing pain last year, and we don't have to get too much into it, but there was a bit of a scandal surrounding the labor abuses at an estate in Puglia in southern Italy. And my take on that one, there's a good article about it on The Cut. If you look up Valentina Pasalacqua on The Cut, for those that want to read about it. My take on it was that it was a moment when I think natural wine was getting into that zone where it loses its ethics. And that's a normal thing to happen when a movement grows, and that movement is deregulated and kind of has sort of ethics at its core. And so I think we might be on a good track now, that we've gotten, I think there's been change since that happened. And I think it's probably going in a more positive direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, so just so people understand, like there's no, if people here are like new to natural wine, there's no certification body for natural wine, correct?
No, there's no certification. They're starting to launch one in France, actually, called Van Méthode Nature, natural method. And that's sort of the first one. I think I've heard of whispers of other things in Europe, something in Hungary even, but it's it's a certification, and you have to have someone visit and prove that you're doing things organically and that you're not, I guess they'll test your wines. Like they'll analyze them in a laboratory to make sure there's no pesticides or no added tartaric acid and things like that. And then I don't know what else you have to prove, but yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely interesting. So maybe people will start using that. Previously, it was just this very, knowledge has been passed down through people. And that's how it was for me when I was kind of coming up in New York. Like people would tell me about visiting that producer, or I'd go to importer tastings and ask lots of questions and meet people there.
Right, right. I'm gonna like entirely switch directions just because that's how I like to roll. But I was like, what I'm really intrigued about, so you start like writing about wine, you start writing more and more about natural wine. And I know that you mentioned in the book that you wanted to write a novel and you're working on that. We all know that like the novel business is probably not the most the easiest. But you did mention in the book that you had wanted to write a book about natural wine. And I'm wondering, book about natural wine and memoir, I mean, you've combined the two, but they also could have been totally separate. And writing a memoir, I mean, I haven't written a memoir, but knowing people who've done memoir, having read memoirs, such a different experience and relationship to like, even you knowing that you're putting very personal stories on the page. And I'm just wondering at what point you just like committed to that and were like, this is what I'm doing. Okay, I'm on board, let's go.
It was really interesting. I first got introduced to an agent and a book editor, I think back in 2016. And it was, my idea was pretty vague, a book about natural wine, but this agent worked with a lot of cookbook authors, and she was pushing me toward something with a lot of pictures, a hardcover guidebook, a coffee table thing, you know, like that would be in the cookbook section maybe. And I just felt like I wanted to do something more literary. And but I was still kind of, you know, floundering around, where's my idea, where's my book? Went on to another agent and started to see it as a narrative nonfiction book. But narrative nonfiction is really broad. I think that encompasses memoir, but it also encompasses like people that set out to do a big book on a topic and they go to visit 5 places, you know, true journalism. And then at some point I realized like, yes, I'm a journalist, but I really just love essayistic writing. And that is a big passion of mine. And I don't mind, you know, using my personal life to tell a story if it engages people. I think that's a great way to get people involved and interested in something. I didn't want it to be dry. I think wine writing could possibly be dry. And I love memoir. I mean, I feel like the book larder community would probably know one of my favorite authors. I loved Molly Wisenberg's The Fixed Stars. Like I aspired to write a memoir like that one day, which is, I think it really grapples with questions around identity. It was sort of difficult for me trying to combine informing and educating people about natural wine with telling my personal story. But my agent was amazing. She's incredible and she is really into natural wine, but she was also really good at seeing where I was trying to do too much or where I needed to kind of beef it up or focus more on the emotions and things like that. So it was quite a journey. And I mean, in a way, the book came out 2021. In a way, you could say it was like 5 years in the making. But yeah, you sort of go the wrong way, and then you find it.
Well, it's life, right? Like we're sort of only capable of seeing the path when we can turn around and see the path. But like whatever the path is moving forward is usually like quite murky. Even if we sort of know what the next 3 steps are, it's like beyond that, like who knows. Yeah, I was actually thinking about that because I was thinking that at the end of at some point in the book, you sort of say something about natural wine sort of having like no definitions. And I was actually thinking about just your path also like not having definitions, and that often for most of us we end up at a place that is usually quite different from what we envision, and it's normally something that is like something that we make. And you end the book, I wrote it down, this is not a spoiler alert, but it's just this line that I really liked, and it was, if it doesn't exist, I guess we can make it ourselves. And I thought that was such a fitting line, because at the end of the day it's like you've also made this life, not just stepped into something that is defined by a box or a structure. It's kind of like, I'm just gonna create and figure out what it looks like. Have you always had that kind of a personality, or is that something that you've sort of come into?
I think at the ripe age of maybe 35, 36, I'm 37 now, is where my personality finally started to work in my favor. I am one of those people, I've had the most difficult time working for other people, holding down full-time jobs. It's just not where I excel. And I think it took me a long time to realize that I'm the kind of person who is a good self-employer, and that I really thrive when I have full license to be creative. And like making natural wine in my little winery where there's no restrictions, no rules, is amazing. And because it's so small batch as well, like, yeah, I can do anything I want. And I find it actually really liberating to not use equipment. So like I talk about that in my book, the choice to my partner at the time, now husband, said, you should make a little bit of wine. And I was like, okay. And I didn't really think about what that meant. And I was feeling so alienated in his winery, and I couldn't figure out why. And then it occurred to me, there's this other shed where there's no equipment and there's a basket press. I'm going to figure out how to use that because it's quiet. I don't need anyone to like use a machine. I don't have to press any buttons. There's nothing to fix. And that was very liberating. And so, yeah, I think I'm just a bit of I have to do things my own way. And like, I am thrilled by doing creative stuff all the time. But I'm also, I think you kind of asked this as well. I'm also, and this is why I was a terrible academic, I need to learn a new skill every few years. And I'm not sure that I'll always make wine. Like, I'm not trying to be a professional winemaker necessarily. So I'm learning a bit about growing flowers at the moment, which is a new skill for me, growing them commercially with irrigation. And maybe that's something that I'll start to get into over the next year or two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool. I think that's interesting too, for maybe like people like in our generation. Like it is, I think we were talking earlier before this call started kind of about this, like just our generation had a very different experience of like coming out of school and 2008, and just like there's just a lot of people I think who maybe are creatively inclined, but I think also just like an environment that kind of facilitated figure something out, and if that doesn't work, do something else. And so like perhaps we're also open to sort of keeping an eye on what the other options are, not just because we want to bail on things, but because it's like I want to keep all the balls in the air because I never know, which I think is an interesting sort of place to be in. Yeah.
Yes.
So we won't spoiler alert the book because everyone should read it, but could you do like a quick synopsis of how you, so you go from New York, you end up in Paris, and now you're in Australia.
Mhm.
Can you do the elevator pitch version of that? Because that's
Yeah.
not normal. That's not like your usual track.
Well, yeah, I had this obsession with moving to Paris. I think I bent many an ear in New York talking about it for probably about 2 years. Was taking French lessons, everything. And then I went on one last kind of trip as, being still like an American wine journalist. So from New York, flew to the Republic of Georgia, was invited by sort of the government in collaboration with an importer. And I joined this big crowd of professionals from all different areas, but all focused on natural wine. And we went around the Republic of Georgia learning and drinking and eating for 8 days. And it was so incredible. It's an area of the world that's just super unique, and most incredible food and wine, really singular. And that was a trip where I met someone. So that was the trip where I met an Australian winemaker who kind of took me off that path. And the other thing is that when I did finally get to Paris and try to settle in there, I had, I guess you could say, this uneasy feeling that I was starting to become the same person I had been in New York. And I was not sure in the end that I had made the right choice. And I was very open to this life that I'm living now, because I had a glimpse of it when I eventually went to visit my wild man, as I call him in the book. And the way he was living, the way we live now, was so mind-blowing to me. It was so radical and different, growing things and kind of self-sufficiency, fresh air, spring water, all of that seemed like possibly what I needed. So I guess, I don't know, there's a saying in India, I think people just say this to travelers maybe, but you make a plan and then God laughs. Because in India, like, you make a plan and then there's no train or something like that. But I think that is actually a really good thing to think about in your life.
Yeah.
Is that you're making a plan, but there might be another plan for you.
That's funny, because my mother is an artist, and I grew up in a house that has just like a lot of colors and things everywhere, but she would like paint there at the top of one of the staircases. She painted this quote that says, "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans." It's that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's that same
exactly.
idea. Yeah, totally. I love that. I want to be mindful of time, because I could just ask you questions this whole time, but I want to leave some time at the end to do questions, and I want us to go in the vineyard with you. So I was wondering if maybe we should do that now, and you could take us, maybe if
let's do it.
As you're walking out there, could you just maybe, somebody dropped in the Q&A to talk about what the name of your vineyard is. So if you could sort of, what's the name of your wine? What are you doing? What's the deal with the vineyard? And give us a little tour.
Yeah, my wine is called Persephone, and you can get it in Seattle at Ray Vino. He has a very small amount, but it's there. We're about to ship the next release. And my husband's wine is called Lucy Margot, or Lucy M. So Lucy Margot is his daughter, who is now 20. And the farm is called Lucy Margot as well. So that's kind of the name of the vineyard. So let's go. I'm wearing a hat because Australia has no ozone layer. So in Australia, when you go outside, you have to wear a hat. And we're going to go to the vineyard I'm in charge of, which is a Chardonnay vineyard planted in spring of 2020, so just over a year ago. So they're baby vines. And we are doing a style of pruning that will make these bush vines. So generally when something is like a bush plant, it means that you're not going to trellis it. You're going to let it grow kind of wild. We are doing a very particular kind of pruning for the past year and a half, which will select a strong base, and then the vines will kind of go up from that base. And there's some evidence that bush training is helps vines be more disease resistant because there's more. My husband's very romance commercial, and I think he is having, I don't know, having a little more fun. So we've made a few sort of less commercial decisions, you might say. So the irrigation this year, so most people would irrigate for the first 3 or 4 years, or some people would irrigate for the entirety of a vineyard's life. But we are kind of hoping that the vines will be tough and therefore produce nicer fruit. So there's an idea that vineyards have to struggle a little bit, and that if they struggle, they can live long fruit and also be disease resistant. Obviously, we are an organic farm, and so we can never use any kind of herbicide or pesticide or fungicide. So those are the 3 on vine growers. And we use hand hose and tractors to keep the weeds in check. And eventually we might use some kind of plant-based. So here's a little Chardonnay vine. So you can see it has just 2 shoots. And eventually we'll select one of the shoots.
Wow.
Yeah, it's 11 rows, which doesn't sound like a lot, but and it's sloping. So it's really exhausting to work here. And then next we'll establish also some kind of cover crop in the rows. So my husband has just gone through with the tractor. So he took care of all the weeds in between the rows, which was great. But we're going to try to sow seeds and have like a cover crop or something, and then we can push it down to mulch. Weed control is a big, big, big deal. Like when you cultivate land where nothing was growing, all sorts of things come up and you just have to manage the weeds. It's one of the most exhausting and difficult things, I think, about farming and growing stuff.
Yeah. And how long, so they're little, you call them little baby Chardonnay. How long do they have to grow before you can harvest and make wine from them? It's a few years. Right?
Yeah, it does depend on the soil type and how quickly they grow, but it'll be at least probably another year or possibly 2 more years. We have one vineyard that is young, which we think will produce some fruit this year, but it'll be small. Yeah, they have to get pretty big before it's like a substantial harvest.
Yeah. Something, just so people who are watching, like, feel free to drop some questions in the Q&A and I'll ask them. Otherwise it's just going to be my questions. But something I was thinking about when I was reading the book is you did an internship where you were working at a vineyard winery in France, and there's this moment when you're doing that where you're picking the grapes and you realize that there's some mold on them and you're not quite sure, and you're told to smell the grapes to smell for vinegar, and if it doesn't smell like vinegar, it's fine. And when I heard that part, I was like, gosh, the responsibility when you're like working for someone else and you know that your choice, like you have to trust yourself. And then that now you're in a different situation because now it's like your vines and your wine.
Oh yeah.
Right.
And right, exactly. And we have to protect our investment. Yeah. And I can tell you that little vineyard, there have been a few cases where, so when you're pruning, one wrong snip can like affect the vine for years. And there's definitely a few where I made the wrong snip, and it's so hard, but it's very difficult actually taking care of a vineyard. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of concentration. So yeah, the stakes are higher. But yeah, when thinking back on that time, like that must have been really hard for that family, because there would have been quite a lot of vinegar potentially in that batch of grapes. But I think the wine turned out okay. Here's a
Yeah.
slightly more, this one's a bit more progressed.
Oh yeah, are those like the other ones are the babies and those are the toddlers maybe?
It's a year older, exactly. That's it. That is exactly it.
I see that. So there's a question that's come in. Somebody who runs a natural wine shop on Long Island in New York. And they say that they sometimes find themselves like at a dead end, quote unquote, defending natural wines with like lovely, lovely human beings, but who are just like stuck on their palates of like having always drunk conventional wines and very manipulated wines. And so she's just wondering, like during your natural wine journey, what has been like the best way to communicate with and like change people or encourage them to she says to go from non-believers to believers.
Yeah, well, they will probably never really like wines like my husband's, which are truly wild. But why don't you slip them something that is natural but tastes very classical? So, for example, Clos Fantine, which is two sisters making wine in the Fougères region of the Languedoc. Like, I think someone at Wine Spectator would give that wine 95 points, and it's natural, organic, nothing added. And there are a few wines like that. So I think just give them those wines and like don't expect them. I think it's very difficult, especially if we're talking about people that are already in their 30s or 40s. Their palates might not change at that point, but you can interest them in organic wines. You can interest them in wines that are better for the environment. You can tell them about glyphosate, which is used in conventional wine, and like it's the weed killer that is considered carcinogenic. You can tell them that pesticides are linked to Parkinson's disease, and if they are the kind of people that like to consume ethically made products, those facts might make them think twice. And then it's just about finding a few producers that they like, which could be more classical in taste.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely a few of them out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I definitely, I've made the error of taking some stuff that I love to like dinner parties where people are like, wow, Anna, what is this? And then you just, you learn from that experience. Let's see, there's another question here. So what would you say to someone who's very interested in the natural wine world, but's not in the industry at the moment? So there aren't much, if any, natural wine courses, and bottles aren't the cheapest. So they've been tasting their way through wines, but their wallet is suffering. So she kind of wants to change careers and get into natural wine world. So do you have sort of like just some recommendations on that? She said it's not really a question, but more of a comment, but maybe there's just some ideas there for, yeah, maybe wanting to shift into that world as a career pathway.
Oh yeah, I definitely have two suggestions. You're gonna have to work part-time in a natural wine shop. It's the only way that you will be able to taste all the wines that you want, because you'll get invited to portfolio tastings eventually, or you can invite yourself. And you'll also get to taste things. Usually the shop manager will open something for the staff like every day. Plus you'll get a massive discount. And it's lower stakes. Like I think restaurants are very intense environments. So if you're just getting into the industry, it might be actually a bit overwhelming. But a wine shop, like it's more, you're just paid by the hour. It's not based on tips. And but the pay is sort of low. So I would definitely just start out part-time and kind of warming up for it. Try to give it a year. You will get to taste so many wines. And yeah, the other thing is form a tasting group, because then you share the cost. So everybody brings a bottle, but you get to try 10 wines. blind tasting them is super fun. It can be challenging with natural wines because they're so atypical, but I don't see any problem with that. It just might be a different kind of blind tasting.
Yeah.
So that's where you wrap it in like a paper bag so you can't see the bottle. And yeah, I think a tasting group is just the best possible way to approach it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That was something that I was thinking about reading your book. I mean, you're a writer, so obviously you have a way with words, and you like, you can find descriptors for things. But I was thinking about in terms of like your descriptors for flavor and taste. Is that something that you have worked on in terms of identifying new and different flavors, cultivating that palate? Or is that just like, do you do specific things to work on that? Or is that just something that has come to you over time, tasting a lot of wine?
I think it's a progression. At first you start out and you're like, oh, this tastes sour. And then you eventually realize that's just the wild yeast. And then you can kind of put that knowledge away and then notice other flavors. Your palate improves so much over time. And yeah, like you just start to notice different aspects of wine. But I think I probably worked really hard. I think I retasted a lot of those wines to try to describe them, or I went back deep into my memory. Like some of them I've had many times, and so I was able to describe them. But I describe things also from my heart. I'm not like, they say a lot of those notes don't really exist. They say minerality doesn't really exist. When you say something smells of violets, supposedly violets don't have a fragrance, but who cares? You're trying to convey the essence of something. So a lot of my tasting notes are very abstract, and I think that's fine. I don't love for people to get hung up on tasting notes. Like for me, it's very useful to say, oh, it's a very strong flavored wine, or it's a very light wine, because then people know whether to have it with certain kinds of foods. But otherwise, don't you just want to be surprised a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about that too in reading the book, like just culturally, wine, I think in the US, very different relationship to wine historically than you have in like, wine producing countries that have like, hundreds of years, France, Italy, where there's sort of a more like regular daily relationship with wine. And here, I think we have that sort of, it has been more of a luxury product, which sort of has like put it into a different category. And sometimes I think just with food in general too, it's almost like we don't trust ourselves, because we're almost like, oh, this is too nice. I can't trust myself to say that it tastes what I think it tastes like. And I was like thinking about that a lot as I was reading your book. And I think like the example that really stood out to me was when you were like making your first wine, you were tasting like the juice, and you mentioned like that you really, when you eat cheese, you really like the rind plus the creaminess, and that was like what you used as your approach to the wine, because you were like, I like these two things together, and in this grape, like I like the stem and I like the juice. And I thought that was like so cool that you just, it's like really a trusting process of like, what you like, and you kind of have to stick with that and kind of just like ground into it.
Yeah, I am totally intuitive, and exactly what you said. I had these grapes in my winery. I'd never actually made my own wine before. And I mean, it wasn't my winery at the time, it was just a shed. And I had to figure out what to do with them. And I said, I'm just going to keep them whole cluster. I'm not going to destem them. I'm going to leave them and let them ferment like this. And that's the kind of decision people, when they go to winemaking school, that they would back up with a whole rationality. They would say, oh, because I want it to taste like this, or I want that, or I want that. And for me, it was like, I'm just going to do what I like, and I'm going to approach it in a way that I like. And that's all. And it was the only thing that I could really do. And that's still how I make wine. It's very much just like I'm in my kitchen, like cooking for friends. So it's the only way I know how to do it.
Yeah. Well, and that's also been your entry point to it as well. So like, of course, that's your experience and your history with it. Yeah. That's why have you met any in your being connected to producers and stuff? Have you met anyone, worked with anyone, interviewed anyone who's transitioned from conventional winemaking to natural winemaking? Like that sort of maybe has a standard, sort of has gone to school, has all the training, and then kind of is like, I got to shift course.
Oh, that sort of thing. I think that's less common that people went to winemaking school. I mean, well, my husband did that, but I don't think he ever made true conventional wine. He worked for a few conventional wineries, but he did go to winemaking school. I think, I mean, I know of younger generations converting their family estates from conventional to organic, which is amazing. And there's an article in issue 10 of Pipette, which talks about this winery in Germany where the family has been making wine for hundreds of years. And then, you know, their young daughter like went, I don't know, she went to London or she went abroad or something and was like exposed to natural wine and came home and was like, Mom and Dad, please, we have to. And it took a lot of convincing.
Yeah.
Like, and they were terrified. And the writer goes into it beautifully. It's a Berlin-based writer, and he does such a great job of talking about this work she had to do to convince her parents to like go down that path. And now their wine is out in the world. It's doing really well, and it's like a cool new brand. So it does happen. And there's a few stories like that. Younger generations, definitely. But you know, I'm starting to hear more about older people coming and knocking on natural winemakers' doors and saying, how do I stop using weed killer? Or how do I can I get some tips? That's definitely happening. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. We have a few more minutes left. I don't see any questions. So I think maybe Laura, should I ask another question or
sure,
do you
go ahead. You have another one. Go for it.
Yeah, my last question for you is just kind of, you lived in Paris, you live in rural, you know, you live on this farm. I was thinking a lot in the book about these sort of like romantic visions and versions of lives that we see or hear about or even romanticize ourselves versus the reality of those lives. And that we sort of have to make a choice or commit to those things once we're in them. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of like, what are the romantic versions of this life that you're currently living, and what is the reality, and how do you kind of like reconcile those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just a lifelong commitment phobe, and that finally committing to something has been so hard, and at the same time it was so necessary and so beneficial for me in terms of personal growth. But yeah, like committing to rural life, I knew nothing when I moved here. I didn't know how to build a fire. I didn't know how to grow things. And like, you know, like I did this whole flower garden in the past like year, and I just had to figure it out all on my own. And we're growing food, and I can make a fire now. I know that you have to collect kindling before the rain comes. Like I've picked up on all of these things. And yeah, I mean, a lot of people around us also used to live urban lives, and now they are in the countryside. So I think I feel a bit of solidarity as well, that like things that I struggle with, other people are struggling with too. Like it can be a little bit isolated. But we have an amazing community of people around us. Like it's summer now, and there's going to be parties with natural winemakers, and like people have amazing taste in music. People are really creative around here. So I've definitely started to get used to it. I have these like fantasies where I'm like, okay, if I was flying into Florence tomorrow, or like say I was dropping through Paris, what would I wear? And I like go into, because I wear my farm clothes every day. Like I've got my boots on. Oh, you said you like Rossi boots. You know, they were discontinued. It's so sad. So we're Blundstones family now. We used to always wear Rossis, but yeah, like life just takes you somewhere, but it's good to commit.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Laura.
thank you so much, Rachel and Anna. It was such
Thanks
a
for
great
having me.
conversation. Oh my
It was
goodness, I'm
good.
so glad we got to do this, and I hope that we get to do it in person at some point.
Oh
Yes.
yeah, count on it.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you always have a place to stay.
I would love
Rachel.
that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I hope that you get to drink lots of natural wine over the holidays and not just over the holidays. I dropped the link to the shop in Seattle that carries the Persephone wine, so you can look into that if you would like. Rachel, congratulations on the book.
Thank
Everyone look
you.
out for Anna's Woodward Canyon label. She's on the new artist series. So if you drink their wine, please look out for Anna's label because it's beautiful.
Thank you.
And Rachel, yeah, like I said, congratulations and thank you so much for joining us all the way from Australia.
That was a great conversation, Anna. Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah,
thanks.
I
So fun.
absolutely count on me coming through Seattle at some point when we can.
Wonderful.
Definitely.
Wonderful.
fun.
Well, I can't wait to do this in person. Thank you,
Yay.
everyone.
With
I hope
wine.
you're- Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Hope you're all
Okay.
staying safe and healthy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Same
so
to you.
much.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.